So what I'm going to be talking about is a class that I put together in collaboration with Kyle and also with Kathy, Megan, and Carrie over the last, so basically about a year and a half before we first did the class in fall 2019, and then did it again this past spring. And then it's currently being tweaked again to come out again in the fall. And this is a history divisional course. It's cross-listed as a WGS elective. It generally has 25 students. And what I'm going to do today is sort of talk about some of the problems that I was trying to address in creating this course. And then I'll try to maintain my focus on this sort of digital primary source reader, which was the centerpiece of the course. But I also thought it might be useful in this moment to talk about the various kinds of digital strategies that I use more broadly in the course, which are not particularly complicated. Maybe you noticed from this, I don't actually consider myself to have a super high level of natural facility with tech. So this might be available to many of you who don't consider yourselves to be technical geniuses. And also talking specifically about this COVID moment and sort of looking forward in that. So the centerpiece of this course was the collaborative student creation of a digital primary source reader. And I'll show you samples from that, and we can talk more about that or other aspects of the course in the Q&A. So I first began designing this course using a TCART grant. And so it's a new divisional course that I created. And the problems that I was thinking about, were issues that face us specifically in the history department, but I think in many ways across the liberal arts, students not feeling like history is that relevant to their lives or will help them get a job, maybe perception of the liberal arts as a whole is kind of narrow and irrelevant. So one of the central things that I was thinking about in designing the course was how to make this class really feel sort of deeply relevant to students, as well as giving them certain kinds of concrete skills. But in a way, the main thing I was going for was a high level of student engagement, which doesn't always happen in divisional classes because of sort of what they're signing up for and sort of how they want to sometimes behave in a more passive way. And then there were some specific skills that I also wanted to work on here, and this in some ways was around what happens when students in history get up to our capstone senior course, what are their research skills, and really wanting to start breaking down research skills, particularly engaging with primary sources, and thinking about ways to make that available and accessible even to students in their first semester. And then the final thing I was thinking about was how often students think about history as a discipline in a pretty narrow way that doesn't necessarily line up with what a lot of us in the department do. And I wanted to really broaden for students that they could see what counts as history isn't just kind of World War II, isn't just military history, isn't just like a bunch of white dudes running countries and fighting wars, and move much more into realms of social and cultural history that overlap certainly with my own research interests, but also with what a lot of us actually do. So these were the problems that I was setting out to address. Now, you don't have to bother reading all of these word for word, but when I and the librarians were sort of talking and thinking about this course, what we came up with were these sort of guiding principles, right? Sort of how we might respond to these problems, and sort of thinking about how we can activate students as creators of scholarship. And this image that I had from the beginning was that I wanted students to be able to do the thing that I get most excited about as a historian, which is go into an archive that I've never been into before, where I don't really know what I'm going to find, and go through some files where I have ideas about what's there, but I don't really know what's there. And I wanted to build to giving students that experience, and then also help them figure out how do they make sense of what might be in those files, and then do something with those things that might feel relevant to them, but maybe also to their friends and to their families, both sort of at Wake and beyond. And then there are also pieces of this that are really trying to center the value of student intellectual labor and giving them a project that they had a sense of ownership for. And a lot of what we worked on with Kyle was ideas about openness and sort of use and reuse. So what we did is create a reader that was open to be reused in various ways by future generations of students. So the students didn't only sort of create the reader themselves, but then the next class of students use that as their textbook, and sort of onward, the idea being as the class, we sort of end up with like a set of textbooks that the students in the future would use, or possibly they would create more narrowed down versions with highlights of the text, you know, that they could do different things with one another's text. And the idea was that this would just feel more relevant to them and they would be more creatively engaged. And because of the public facing nature of the project, that it wouldn't just be me as the audience, that they would hold themselves to higher standards. And another piece that happened here was a lot of letting go of control, right? Granting students ability to make a lot of decisions in the course. In multiple situations, they made decisions that I, or maybe Kyle, didn't necessarily want them to make. But our desire was that they get that space, and that in general, the hope was that students would take more risks and pursue their own existing and evolving interests than seeking to hit some kind of, you know, a rubric that was really tight or, you know, really specific set of goals that I had for them. So, you know, in general, just thinking about how the course was designed, you know, I started with backwards design. I'll show you the student learning outcomes, which focused on, you know, sort of several areas: skills, knowledge, and affect. But I also designed the course really, the content would be somewhat different semester by semester, and really aiming the content at particular archival collections. Because again, one of my central goals was to help them approach particular archival collections. And so I worked with Megan Mulder to kind of design certain aspects of the content around what we have in special collections, with the hope that I could give them enough background that they could then go into special collections and engage to some degree with what they found there. And then I also built around, there were particular exhibits that were relevant at the Rinaldi House Museum in the first semester, and some stuff at the Museum of Anthropology, where again, I sort of geared the content towards getting them to be able to make better sense of those physical archives. In the way that the project was designed, there are individual chapters. So each student, the idea is that each student has their own primary source that they have, that they've selected through engaging with different archives. And then that they do an interpretive bit with that primary source. In the original edition, it was writing an introductory essay and then annotating that primary source, sort of excerpting or using the entire primary source, depending on what it was. Maybe it's visual, but putting some kind of annotation on the source itself using footnotes, as well as writing the introduction. As we moved into COVID time, we became a bit more creative, and we were like, well, your interpretation of that source could be in a range of genres, or it doesn't have to be so narrowly sort of essay footnotes. And I'll show you some of those examples of other forms of interpretation. So some of the work was individual, but we also did work in teams, sort of creating teams to do different sections, create cover art, do the preface, do different kinds of editing. And with the pivot online, the work in teams became much more important, and I sort of really zhuzhed up the degree to which they were working in teams, and actually did this very elaborate structuring of like putting them into groups with one another where I knew that they had trust with one another. And they would work together in breakout rooms within Zoom sessions, and then also outside of that. And some of them did collaborative projects at that point, and others kind of worked in a panel, sort of working together to help one another push their individual projects. And this project it was both digital and print. So initially we had thought it would just be digital, but then we were like, oh, we could just, you know, print out a book. And we worked with the Library Partners Press to actually print out a book the first time. They became very excited about the idea of a print book, which added a whole other layer of labor. But then what we were able to do with that is have a book launch party. So we then brought together students from the first semester with students from the second semester, obviously this was before COVID, at a book launch party in special collections. And it was a pretty fantastic moment. There was some, you know, sort of fan stuff, you know, it felt like a book launch party. It was exciting, and students, some of them had others sign their books. Some other folks came in, and all of this really made it feel like it was just kind of a more substantial and meaningful project. I'll talk a little bit more about how I scaffolded, sort of trying to build up their skills in order to help them learn how to make sense out of primary sources. And, you know, a lot of this is sort of coming up with different ways to help them interpret different kinds of sources, not sort of finding different kinds of primary sources, kinds of secondary sources, and then also sort of playing with different ways of putting those together, which is really the trickiest piece, right? Particularly for first year students, that stuff is pretty difficult to do. And then sort of underlying all of this, or sort of helping all of this work, once I got tenure, which was just this last year, I realized one of the things that I struggled with the most in teaching was things around grading that felt punitive and punishing and often not taking me where I wanted to go with my interactions with students. So one of the things that we did in this class was use something called ungrading, which if you're not familiar with, is it's a way of setting up kind of that students assess themselves. And it's in some ways can be sort of loose and open and scary, but we set up systems of daily self-evaluation and then a midterm and final self-reflection where students reflected on their experiences against certain collective norms that we had come up with, and then would pitch a grade, which I then at the midterm had a fair amount of back and forth with them on. Sometimes I was like, well, you need to take that grade up a little bit. Other times I was like, yeah, maybe not. But a lot of what it was about is building students' own capacity to articulate and sort of reflect on their own experiences, as well as articulate what skills they'd gained. And ungrading in conjunction with the project, the way that the project was the center of things, both of these things really did allow students to take a lot more risks than they otherwise would have done. And there were this also tied into having collaborative values and goals, and that students were not in competition in any way with one another. One student's excellent project helped other students also do an excellent project. They weren't trying to do better than one another. There was no curve here. I don't really want to sit on these, but these were the student learning outcomes. So one of the things I also wanted to break out for you all, particularly in this moment, was sort of the different kinds of digital processes that we used, a lot of which were collaborative. And you'll see here, these were really pretty simple. A lot of what we did was in Google Sheets. We had reading journals for kind of daily reading accountability, research journals, sort of progress of the research. We did a bunch of chapter kind of decision making around the chapters in using Google Sheets as well. And then also, as they were increasingly working in small groups, particularly, once we pivoted online, a lot of that work was sort of noted and organized within Google Sheets as well. I used Google Docs to some extent. At the beginning of every class, I would do play some music or some video or something that related to stuff that we're doing. I asked students if they would research sort of kinds, the class is supposed to be international, right, as well as historical. So I asked students to go and find stuff that they thought related to the themes of the class, and ideally somewhat international, somewhat historical. And we communicated about that in a Google Doc, so they would also have a record and could follow up on stuff. We used Google Docs to some degree for peer reviews along the way. If we have time, I want to show you the LibGuide that we use that Kathy Shields made for us to sort of help guide students into sort of selected primary and secondary source databases around these different subjects of gender and sexuality. And we did particular activities in relation to these databases. So, initially we were doing them in the classroom. So, they did stuff with the LibGuide outside of class. Kathy Shields would also come in and kind of walk them through different kinds of exercises with these databases. One of the things I started them out with was trying to find things on their own, just using whatever search techniques they had at their disposal, basically go Google some stuff. Some of them had a little more than that, and sort of come up against the limitations of their existing research processes. And then, sort of walk them through how they would try to find out about similar stuff, and how that might look different depending on which databases they were using and what you get out of using particular different databases. The actual digital site was up in Pressbooks, and as I said, they did individual pages, and then also there were aspects of it that were done in groups. Particularly sort of thinking about sort of structural decisions and editing and all that was done more collaboratively or in small groups. And then again, with the COVID pivot, there were more kind of group projects and pair projects than there had been initially. I also used Qualtrics to some degree. For example, I came up with a pretty detailed Qualtrics survey right when we did that pivot. I wanted to find out where they were in terms of their technological capacities. At that point, we had enough trust built up that I also felt like I could ask them about what their personal situations were like during COVID, and sort of thinking now about to what degree I can do that before the fall starts. I also, the decisions that I made around how much were we going to do synchronous, asynchronous, et cetera, was based on what I then learned about their time zones and, there's sort of various kinds of capacity, right? I was trying to make it as broadly accessible as possible. And then I also used Qualtrics for some very detailed course evaluations that then helped me respond to sort of make some somewhat major shifts in the class from semester to semester. And then when we shifted over, I did mostly synchronous, related to what students had expressed as far as their desire for that kind of connection, as well as their technological capacities. We did sort of both small and large group discussions. I had them broken up in different ways. Like I said, a 25 student class, not gonna go great with large Zoom discussions. But when we did have larger groups, one of the things that I did that was really helpful was create these chat rituals where we wouldn't talk. It wasn't like chat at the same time as us talking, but I would separate out a space at the beginning and the end of class where we silently use the chat to think about their particular, I think I put this later on here. Yeah, so, I put this down at the bottom as a way of creating a sense of community and connection, something fun or funny, pasting or describing links that they've been engaging with, doing something new they learned or did in quarantine, some kind of kindness they did or saw. So a lot of what I was trying to do, both in the project and in the structure of the class, was really around fostering various forms of trust and connection. And these are some of the ways that I tried to think about doing that through this transition, this pivot. And then at the end, they did panel presentations online, sort of in their groups, sharing their projects with the class. Let me see. So I want to show you a bit of the book, but also just so you have a sense of what it was like for the second class of students to use the first class of students' book. So the idea wasn't just that they would see it and be impressed by it, although they certainly were, but they also did a sort of structured critique of it, with the idea that we then shifted what we were doing, sort of to try to see if we could go beyond what the first group of students had done. A lot of these efforts, some of them did pan out, some of them didn't so much because of the COVID situation. All right, so I wanted to show you the book a little bit. Let's see. So this is the cover of the book. The cover was made from cover art that some students, designed in a group of cover art students. They came with a couple of different examples and then put this together. That was a really cool way that some of the students who are a little less kind of verbal could sort of shine. You see some Creative Commons attribution licensing up here. That was a whole discussion in both the classes where they learned about Creative Commons and made some decisions that weren't necessarily the ones that Kyle and I were hoping they would make, but that seemed like an important set of conversations for them to have. Sort of going into it, they wrote, as I said, a couple of collaborative pieces, and then you can see here kind of the structure of the book is chapters within different sections. They came up with the sections after they had already chosen their topics, and one of the things that we spent a lot of time doing was looking at the different topics people were considering and trying to come up with a way that those could fit together, right? And sort of feel like they fit together organically, when in many ways they didn't. One of the ways that we evolved this process into the second semester was sort of using Google Sheets to play out kind of different, as students chose between multiple sources they were interested in, kind of thinking about different ways that other students' choices might affect, the decisions that they were making. So trying to have more of an international spread, trying to, make sure that there were various kinds of voices of people of color, of sort of folks dealing with different topics, maybe a broad range of time. And that was certainly something that the second class sort of learned from the first, although ultimately what we chose was dramatically shaped by what happened with COVID. So I'll just show you briefly a couple of the pages. Some students chose, works of art, which they interpreted. I was encouraging them to use various, I learn Chicago style, for example, to do annotation. This was a student who sort of dug into some erotic photographs and learning about sort of some ways in which those photographs have been framed wrong in the text that they were framed in. She went and worked with Mona O'Neill over in art history to help her interpret these. So these ones I'm showing you are kind of more, these are more like research papery looking ones. Other students did, like students working with Kathy Acker, sort of much more intense annotations, which was something I was hoping they would do, sort of just constantly explaining like what's going on with each of these, references that's happening within the source itself. Other students, so we did a bunch of work with advertisements. That was in part because we were trying to work with this.
I don't know if you intended to stop sharing, but we can't see your screen anymore. Sorry.
Did not. Just clicked on the wrong thing. Thank you. All right. Do we see an analysis of women wartime advertisements? Thank you.
Thanks.
So we spent a bunch of time working on learning how to analyze advertisements. That was in part because there was this Ronaldo House exhibit related to sort of masculinity and advertising. So as part of building up to that, we looked at some sources, some secondary sources with techniques for how to analyze advertisements. We looked at digitized versions of Life magazine. We looked at popular culture magazines when we were in the physical archive. And so I think because we had that broad set of tools and then sort of different ways of accessing advertisements, a number of students in that first iteration were really interested in that and did sort of various versions of that. Sometimes just looking at one advertisement, sometimes comparing a couple. Several of them did that. And then, yeah, students also sort of looked in some cases at really local sources. This student found a North Carolina source. Students in the first iteration did not go as international as I had hoped, but we talked about that quite a lot when they were making their decisions, and we're sort of thinking about why the nature of how archives are structured, why the nature of existing sort of what we think we understand is structured, how that might shape these things. And the second iteration of the class was initially going to go kind of more international, though again, that changed. So to come back to where we sort of how we shifted with COVID. So I want to then show you what happened with the second semester. So with COVID, the students decided that what they actually wanted to do was change their topics to respond to the crisis. And so I left it up to the students. I was like, if you're really attached to your existing topic, of course you can do that. But most of them decided to change and do something that sort of turn to the past in a way that would help them understand or think about what's going on in the present. One student set up a really impressive kind of oral histories interview project where she did all these recordings of friends that she had around the country, sort of what is going on right now, how is COVID affecting people in different situations differently. A lot of other students turned to making either explicit or explicit historical comparisons. A number of them did projects related to the AIDS crisis, turning to the 1918 flu, and that student sort of took quotes from letters written by college students in 1918 and then drew kind of parallels to the present day. Another student was just like thinking about masks and then was looking at sort of gender in relation to masks in certain regions of Africa. So, this to me really fit into our larger overall goal of just having this project feel relevant. And it also was exciting that students felt that they could turn to history and turn to primary sources as, in some cases, a source of solace, a source of trying to make sense of the current moment. And then, again, the central goal continued to be trying to foster for students a sense of community and connection. And so something that I know we're all thinking about a lot, and like, how are we doing these digital or blended spaces? And one of the things I struggled with was, what do we use synchronous spaces? Students really wanted it. It seemed the most normal to them, right? But it also, in many ways, highlighted inequities and differences when you see what's going on in different students' houses. And the students in this class, for various reasons, tended to be from a much broader range of backgrounds than many other classes. That could have been, I don't know, that could be good, that could be bad. In this case, often students were pretty explicit about what their personal situations were, and we had enough trust basis that it felt like that wasn't necessarily a destructive force. I don't know what it would be like if you just start off that way. And as I said, one of the things I did here was move them into these trust-based working groups. And that was something that they said really, really helped them, with sort of feeling an ongoing sense of connection, and the fact that they could decide who they worked with was really helpful. yeah, so that's what we did with the COVID transition. The last thing I want to do is show you sort of where they came to with their new projects. So, you know, in both cases, the books were, if all I was doing was looking at the product, I would think that they were pretty uneven, right? There was just a huge range of what students had done. You know, my priority was personally more on the process, that they learn how to do various kinds of skills, that they practice them, you know, but certainly in the first iteration, I was like deprioritizing the product in the way that I paced everything out with timing. The students didn't like that. They were like, we are giving this product to a lot of people. We want it to look as good as possible. So the second time I pushed up the calendar and was really trying to give them more time to make the product look sort of shinier, make sure that, you know, they had plenty of time to revise and revise and revise. All of that was, again, you know, sort of overturned by what happened with COVID. But so, you know, there's also an unevenness here, particularly in the post-crisis time, where my priority was that each student complete something, but that students were in such a wide range of places that, again, what that meant and how much time they put into it varied widely, but I wanted them to all have a sense of completion of something. So that was another thing that I worked with each of them on individually. What is it that you can do in this time? One of the more impressive products of this post-COVID time was a student who, she was a graduating senior, so that's, you know, part of why it looks a little fancier. So she learned, so you know, as I said, in this iteration, they could respond in many ways to their primary source. So this student learned about zines for the first time, you know, thanks in part to some resources that Kyle passed her way. And so she produced a zine, and then she was looking at she's an EMT, her dad before was an EMT. She, under quarantine, went through the basement and found some old textbooks of her dad's from the 80s and was looking at this sort of deep homophobia in the EMT manual's responses to, you know, the early period of the AIDS epidemic. And she saw parallels between that and the xenophobia that was part of the responses that she was being given as an active EMT in the early part of COVID. And so she basically used sort of cut and pasted, I think in some cases literally, in some cases digitally, from these current EMT manuals and then these EMT manuals that she found in her father's archive from the 80s. And, you know, did a mix of sort of hand stuff and digital stuff. The other students were very impressed by this one, as was I, sort of drawing these parallels. Yeah, it goes on. She spent quite a lot of time on this. Some of the other ones, some students did sort of more creative kind of art exploration projects, photo diaries. You know, we encouraged them to do things like that, exploring where they were, but to make sure that they had some kind of connection to history. This student actually was not super historical, but, you know, he wrote some poetry in here, you know, was taking these photographs, and then he had done some research on sort of female leadership. So he was kind of making the case that if we just had a woman leader instead of Donald Trump, this all would have been better. You know, I really did let students have quite a bit of leeway here because I wanted them to do something that felt relevant to them. Another project related to the AIDS epidemic, sort of critiquing lack of Black and Latinx representation in sort of AIDS art. You know, I'd mentioned one where a student was inspired by mask making. You see them drawing little parallels here, which again, like this is really a stretch, but I was like, I just wanted them to be, you know, making whatever leaps they needed to make for things in the present to feel like they could be shaped by the past. All right, so I'm happy during the Q&A to go back over, you know, sort of show you more of other things the students did, aspects of, you know, ways that I scaffolded the project or whatever. I'll look at the syllabus. I mean, I have various documents up, but I don't want to give you a million documents, especially because I'm not doing great at managing what's on my screen here. But I will put back up this and I'll open it up to the Q&A. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Mir. That's a great presentation. We have one open question. It says, your students' research topics are incredible, scholarly and professional. What guidance do you provide to students who are new to archival research on how to identify their research questions? Or do you sort of encourage serendipity research where the collection materials that are available are what drive the question?
So yeah, let me show you. I mean, so look, these are actually mostly first-year students. So most of them did not have really experience with doing research. So, we really tried to scaffold this process. Kathy Shields made this incredibly helpful. You can see the LibGuide, right? So she made this really helpful LibGuide, which we kind of tweaked over the course of the 2 semesters. And then we just kind of worked with them on the different aspects of the LibGuide. And, so we started out with just like working on how do you read in a general way as an academic, and then how do you read primary and secondary sources differently? What is a primary source? What is a secondary source? And then, started, so here, I had there's a reading journal that reflected these kinds of questions, sort of trying to teach them sort of how to read a primary source. So that trying to teach them how to come to different kinds of sources with these questions. So, part of it was just that daily work as we read texts of just starting to think about texts, right, as a historian in particular. And then when we looked at sort of particular sets of collections, letting them just freely look, just like go into the biggest database there is and come up with something. That didn't go great. I mean, some of them had ideas for what they wanted to do, but generally that was too big. But so there are so many amazing sort of publicly available collections of things that are narrowed down already in different ways. So, students did work in these particular collections and we led them in some of that, or we sort of let them go free in other ways with ideas of how you might narrow it down. And I separated them into sort of the first half of the class, we topically focused more on gender, the second half of the class more on sexuality, so that we were also working on different analytical frameworks, right? So, and then I would go back and forth with them sort of as they developed their projects to try to do something that was plausible within this amount of time. And yeah, there's just sort of a lot of really deliberate scaffolding and going back and forth.
Okay, we have time for more questions if folks would like to submit more. There was a request to share the course goals and learning objectives slide again, if that's possible. And I also want to point out that the slide decks from all the presentations will be archived on the DH at Wake website.
Yeah, I didn't really pause much on the student learning outcomes. I had given you our guiding principles, which is a little bit different. The student learning outcomes were more oriented to them.
Okay, and then there's a question about whether Wake Forest has a University Pressbooks account, and Kyle chimed in that we do in fact have a Pressbooks account through the Domain of One's Own initiative, as well as through the university's digital publishing imprint, Library Partners Press. I don't know if you want to speak any more about, sort of that collaboration or what it was like to use that platform.
Yeah, I mean, again, I did not want to do like a digital class, right? I'm not instinctively drawn to technology for its own sake. And I sort of came to this because as I developed the class, I was like, oh, I think this is a good idea to fit the goals that I want to fit. But I also started kind of working with Kyle and he made me feel like it would be okay because I wouldn't have to do it by myself. And so, he did a tremendous amount of work. Carrie Johnston also helped with a bunch of the back end stuff. But Kyle also helped students actually did a bunch of that work themselves of kind of putting it onto Pressbooks. So and then this wasn't always a good idea, but it's not that hard to use. So students can actually do a fair amount of it if you want to kind of hold their hand and if you're also okay with it looking like a little bit messier than if you did it yourself. But it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. I don't know if Kyle wants to add anything else to that or if folks have specific questions, but yeah.
I'll quickly chime in and say that the messiness of it, I think, contributed to the authenticity of the overall project. When we're trying to do in the real world, whatever that means, when we're trying to do any kind of project, we have to figure out the tools to use. And students were exposed to scholarship from the point of confronting the archives and generating a research question all the way through the output of that process, which was figuring out the tool and how to arrange a book. Everything was hands-on. It was super messy and often failed, but we had the luxury of some time with them and took advantage of it.
And just to that point, thank you for the point about the messiness. I think that encouraging the students to not only create their digital artifacts and to get in and learn the digital tools, but also just to see that there's that it's not, everything's not perfectly laid out, that the archives can be messy, gives them an entry point as well. They don't feel like they have to be perfect or they have to know everything in order to jump in and begin discovering history via, primary source materials. And so that was something for me that as an educator was also really illuminating to see students learn that way. And Mir, I have a question for you kind of in terms of audience. Could you speak to how the students, have you noticed a difference in your students' writing in terms of them anticipating an audience, a larger audience beyond you or just beyond their classmates? Have you noticed a difference?
Yeah, I mean, there was a range. I think certainly students were thinking about a broader audience, but that didn't necessarily mean that they had the writing skills or that we had the time for them to be, it's like they had the time to write it as well as they could, but we weren't able to really devote the time to what does it mean to write for, a broad public as opposed to what you would do in a research paper. I think if you had a year to do this or, if you weren't also juggling all of the different pieces, I think that would be a really cool way to, if you were just doing a slightly different thing, thinking about writing for different audiences and focusing in that way would be really cool. I mean, we talked about genre of writing more sort of as readers, right? And as kind of aspirational writers, but knowing we couldn't get real far with that on our own. Certainly we were thinking a lot as we read different texts. I tried to give them texts to read from a broad range of genres with a broad range of audiences and talk about those differences. But certainly at this level, again, largely first-year students, the writing skills just aren't there yet to be able to write for a broader range of audiences. Most of them.
So another question in the Q&A is, if you could change one thing in the class or semester, what might that be?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about that quite a bit right now, as I'm sort of looking forward to the future. One of the pieces I am struggling with is that's actually that gap between students' ability to produce something that really makes sense to the audiences that they're trying to write for, right? So that actually did feel like a gap when the ways that they were trying to produce and then their abilities to hit that audience. And I don't quite know how to do that given all the different things that we're trying to do. In the second iteration of the course, the book that we made, other students were interested in it. They wanted extra copies. They wanted to give it to their family members. Their friends were interested. A group of students in the Women's Center heard about it and wanted me to come talk to them. They wanted, people wanted to read it, but there's definitely a gap of its actual readability. So that's one of the things that I think we're gonna, I don't quite know how we're gonna solve that, because some of it is about writing skill, but maybe we'll be thinking more about different genres of writing. Because I think the first time I did give them kind of a template of find a primary source, introduce that primary source, annotate that primary source, right? With the idea being, this is a history class. I want them to learn what different kinds of footnotes are. I want them to be able to make a primary source legible to a bunch of other people. It'll be in whatever register that is, right? And a kind of more academic register. But then what I saw during the COVID time was they were doing photojournals. They were they were at that point producing for a very different audience. So that's one of the things that I'm going to be really wrestling with this next semester, is like, how do I balance helping them have those academic skills with, if they want to produce for non-academic audiences, how can I help them use those same skills to effectively reach those broader audiences?